Henry Box Brown was an antebellum-era man who managed to escape to freedom from his enslavement on a Virginia plantation. How did he do it? By mailing himself in a wooden box. No, seriously, that's how he did it. However, his unlikely escape is only the beginning of his remarkable story. So, today we're going to take a look at the man who literally mailed himself to freedom. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other unbelievable escape stories you would like to hear about. Okay, time to take a look at a man who truly thought outside the box. Henry Box Brown was born in the state of Virginia in either 1815 or 1816. We're not exactly sure which year it was because although records were kept of plantation slaves, they weren't always accurate when it came to recording births. In 1808, the United States banned all slave imports, meaning that any new slave workers had to be those who were born on American soil. At the time, many southern states encouraged slave breeding programs, essentially treating them no differently than cattle. Virginia was one of the harshest slave states, full of labor-intensive tobacco-growing plantations. Slaves in this state were also not permitted to learn how to read and write. At some point prior to 1848, Brown married a fellow slave, a woman named Nancy who was owned by another slaveholder. He had to obtain permission from both his owner and hers in order for the marriage to be officiated, although slaves didn't legally marry like free people did during the time. There were no government forms or marriage licenses involved in their unions. A ceremony still took place. Henry and Nancy went on to have several children, all of whom were considered the property of Nancy's owners. She was also sold more than once during their marriage. One of her owners, Samuel Cottrell, took money from Brown in exchange for promising not to sell her and their children again. Of course, Cottrell, being a human trafficking racist, didn't exactly feel beholden to a deal made with a slave. He went back on his word and sold Brown's family in August of 1848. Brown never saw them again, and historians have not located them in any existing plantation records. Now on his own, with nothing left to lose, Brown came up with a plan to escape. He hired a local abolitionist and storekeeper named Samuel Smith, as well as a free black man named James C.A. Smith, no relation, to help him with his scheme. James C.A. Smith built Brown a wooden box that was 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and around 2.5 feet deep. It was just large enough to hold a man in a cramped, knees-bent position, so basically like a coach seat on an airplane. Then, using his storefront as cover, Samuel Smith mailed the crate to the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. But escaping slavery wouldn't be as easy as just climbing in a box. Before Henry Brown could even get to the mailing himself part of the plan, he first had to come up with a way to get out of the fields that day, which was no easy feat. It's not like he could call in sick. Slave owners weren't the most compassionate people, so only very extreme injuries could keep you from working. Things like sprained ankles and pulled muscles weren't enough of an excuse. But Brown was willing to do whatever it took. So, he took some sulfuric acid, also known as oil of vitriol, and dumped it over his hands, burning them practically to the bone. It had to be overwhelmingly painful, but that's what it took to get out of that day's work. However, it meant that he had to travel in a cramped wooden box with his hands freshly melted, and there was no way that he could receive any first aid while in transit. On March 24, 1849, a group of abolitionists known as the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee received the crate that Henry Brown had hidden himself in. His journey was treacherous, as no one knew that the box contained human cargo. And we've all seen the state in which some packages arrive. It's like airmail means dropped out of a plane. Brown even spent some of the trip upside down, which only added to his agony. Thankfully, the committee was expecting human cargo and opened the box immediately. Brown emerged from the crate and quickly passed out, which is totally understandable considering the ordeal he'd just been through. On top of that, he had nothing to eat or drink for the past 27 hours except a few crackers and a small amount of water. Also, did we mention his hands? But once he was conscious again, he burst into song, an improvised version of a psalm from the Bible. The plan had worked. He was free. After Brown arrived in Philadelphia, he received a lot of attention, for obvious reasons. It's not every day someone escapes slavery by mailing himself in a crate. Accounts of his journey to freedom were published in the newspaper, and Brown was asked to speak at several anti-slavery conventions. It was at one of those conventions that he received his nickname, Box. The nickname fit, essentially telling the story of his escape in a single word. Box Brown's story made him a hero to many, but not to everyone. For example, the legendary statesman and abolitionist Frederick Douglass criticized Brown several times for publicizing the way in which he escaped slavery. Which kind of makes sense. You want to keep certain cards close to your chest, particularly the cards about your secret box mailing scheme. Douglass was upset with Brown because he believed that other slaves could have used the same method to escape had Brown not essentially snitched on himself. In fact, several slaves attempted to have Samuel Smith and James C.A. Smith ship them in crates as well, but their plans were thwarted by suspicious people who had heard of Brown's story. Henry Box Brown immediately went to work speaking out against the horrors of slavery at conventions and gatherings organized by the Anti-Slavery Society. The group was founded by Arthur Tappan and William Lloyd Garrison, and its members included well-known abolitionist supporters such as Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Robert Purvis, and Frederick Douglass. Brown was among the elite when he spoke at their conferences. Together with James C.A. Smith, the free black man who helped him escape, Brown put together a panorama of slave scenes. At the time, panoramas consisted of multiple pictures that were printed on large pieces of canvas. The panorama would spin, allowing people to see all of the images without having to move. Think of it like a precursor to a PowerPoint presentation, only much less boring. Smith and Brown started calling their show The Mirror of Slavery. In the 1851 narrative of his life, Henry Box Brown outlined his plan for curing America of slavery. For starters, he wanted for the northern states to come down hard on what he called the spoiled southern states. He also wanted a new president of the United States to be elected, which is understandable since at the time, the president was the thoroughly unremarkable Millard Fillmore, whose biggest distinction as being the president nobody ever remembers. That doesn't even sound like a real name. No offense, Millard Fillmore fans. But the most important change Brown advocated for was giving slaves the right to vote. He believed that by being allowed to vote and run for office, enslaved blacks would end slavery. Henry Box Brown became alarmed when the U.S. government passed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and with good reason. According to the law, any person deemed a fugitive slave could be abducted in free states by slave catchers, who could then return the slave to the South. Since Brown wasn't legally a free citizen, he was in fact a fugitive slave, he quickly moved to England, where no slave catcher could find him. He took the mirror of slavery with him, and had a falling out with James C.A. Smith as a result. While living in England, Henry Box Brown married his second wife, a white actress from Cornwall named Jane, in 1855. The couple had one child together, a girl named Annie. By this time, Brown was moving away from the mirror of slavery and his abolitionist speeches and began working on becoming a circus and stage performer. Both his wife and daughter performed in shows with him. Henry Box Brown's final career was that of a magician or mesmerist, which is what we would now call a hypnotist. He called himself the African Prince, and sometimes even popped onto the stage from the same box that had carried him to freedom. You'd think being a magician he would have known not to reveal the secrets of his escape. Brown was criticized by abolitionists for having seemingly turned his back on the cause. But after everything he had endured, including the loss of his entire family, he just wanted to make a living on his own terms and leave his past behind him. Which is tough to argue with. Did we mention what happened to his hands? Henry Box Brown worked to create two different autobiographies of his life. The first was titled Narrative of Henry Box Brown, who escaped from slavery enclosed in a box 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, written from a statement of facts made by himself, with remarks upon the remedy for slavery. And yes, that whole thing was the title. It was like a Fiona Apple album. The book was written with the help of Charles Stearns and was published in 1849, shortly after Brown arrived in Philadelphia. His second memoir was a much more concisely titled Narrative of the Life of Henry Box Brown, written by himself. Published in 1851, it contained mostly similar material to what was in the first book. But mailing yourself in a box is one of those stories that never gets old. After living in England for several years with his new wife and child, Henry Box Brown moved back to the United States. Later on, he and his new family settled in the province of Ontario, Canada. Even though the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, he felt more comfortable living outside the U.S., in an area surrounded by other former slaves who had escaped. He continued working as a magician and mesmerist in Canada, where he stayed until his death in 1897. So what do you think about the life of Henry Box Brown? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.